Hello and welcome to another edition of Book Review here at CCXP Exam Simulator. This is Michael Bartlett and today we're going to be reviewing This is Marketing, You Can't Be Seen Until You Learn to See by Seth Godin. So, my book notes for the text are as follows. So firstly, he says, all effective marketing makes a promise. I think this is a good note to bring away from this book because a lot of times people will advertise their products and they sometimes will forget what the actual job to be done is of the end user. What is the goal they're trying to accomplish? And so by always having that in mind, you can make sure that you're meeting that goal by saying, here's our promise. Here's your brand promise essentially. Here's how we will make sure that you can achieve your goal by using our product or service. So it's always something to bear in mind and keep at the front of your mind is all effective marketing makes a promise. What is the promise that you're making? This kind of drills into customer experience because obviously customer experience is all about meeting that promise. He said it's important to know the worldview of your minimal viable audience. Now, the minimum viable audience, this is an idea that he's come up with, which is you don't need to try and sell to everybody. If you've got a small group of people that you're selling to, sometimes that's enough, especially for a good start. You can always grow that. I'm going to read something from the book now. This is page 29 where he talks about that. He talks about a section called Worldviews and Personas. So I'm going to quote the book as follows. Which people? If you have to choose 1,000 people to become your true fans, who should you choose? Begin by choosing people based on what they dream of, believe and want, not based on what they look like. In other words, use psychographics instead of demographics. Just as you can group people by the color of their eyes or the length of their ring fingers, you can group them based on the stories they tell themselves. Cognitive linguist George Lakoff calls these clumps worldviews. A worldview is the shortcut, the lens each of us uses when we see the world. It's our assumptions and biases, and yes, stereotypes about the world around us. We can make pretty good assumptions about how someone will react or respond to a piece of news or a work of art if we have evidence about their worldview. Now, something similar was covered in the book What Customers Crave by Nicholas Webb, and in that book he said that beliefs are the essence of personas, and you can segment those personas simply by looking at what people love and what people hate. So that book is saying something similar. And I think they're essentially getting at the same thing. If you know exactly who you're selling to, then it's going to be easier to sell to them. He says 1,000 raving fans is sometimes all that's needed to make a living. You know, I was involved in this exercise recently at our local school where there was a lot of role playing, and I basically went along and interviewed a number of students. And as the conversations started to evolve, one of the things that became apparent is that a lot of these students actually weren't so much really interested in learning how to play the game and interview right to get a job in the corporate world. A lot of them were entrepreneurs, and they were kind of asking my advice. One of them was a YouTuber who'd kind of started and given up relatively quickly. And this is a really good piece of advice that Seth has in this book, because essentially what he's saying is you don't actually need that many customers to do really well. Like, they're always worrying about trying to get more subscribers and will I ever be like some of these big quote unquote influencers. And Seth actually says the number tends to be around 1,000. Basically, if you have 1,000 people that are big believers in your brand, that are raving fans, you can actually make a living from that. So it's an easier end goal than what people might think. You don't have to have 1 million subscribers. He looks into buying motivation, and he said basically the motivation to buy comes from a number of things. Obviously, solving the person's problem, i.e. their job to be done, but then also status is a big one as well. People tend to buy to either maintain or to increase their status. It's all signaling, right? And then also people have an identity. Matt Watkinson talks about this in his book, The 10 Great Principles of Customer Experience. Basically, people identify with a group and then also have their own identity. And in this particular text, Seth is talking about the group identity. You may not explicitly even think about it, but when you go into a store and you look at certain products, you don't realize you're doing this, but you'll often say, well, someone like me wouldn't buy that kind of thing. Sometimes it might even be, someone like me would never be able to drive a car like that kind of thing. So he basically says that those are the essences of buying motivation. I thought that was pretty interesting. He talks about trust. He said trust is earned by action and frequency of action. So if we go back to the YouTube, for example, I think they did a few videos and they gave up. What basically Seth is saying is, you've got to show up every day and you've got to do the hard work. You keep doing that and people will slowly begin to trust you more by the action and the frequency of your action. And he said basically if you reach a point where people care, then guess what? You've got a brand. When people put the effort in, and Dan Locke talks about this in his book as well, you put the effort into social capital, that becomes free ideas that spread. And then what Seth says in his book is, well, to make a business out of that, what you need to then do is have monetized expressions of those ideas. So people are familiar with the ideas that you talk about in your content marketing and so forth, but then if you can have a monetized expression of one of those, boom, suddenly now you've got something that you can sell and you can actually turn that into a viable business. He talks about building a bridge between early adopters over something called the Trough of Disillusionment. That's mentioned in something called the Gartner Hype Cycle. I'm actually going to show you the graph of this at the end of this book review. But for now, let me go ahead and just quickly read a passage from the book. So this is from page 238, and it talks about Zig Ziglar. So I'm going to read as follows. Zig Ziglar was a door-to-door salesman of pots and pans. In the 1960s, this was a thing. Most of the 3,000 representatives in his company followed the same plan. They filled their cars with samples and hit the road. They'd visit a town, make all the easy sales, then get in the car and drive to the next town. So early adopters are easy to find and easier to sell to. However, Zig had a different strategy. He got in his car, found a new town, and moved in. He took a room for weeks at a time. He showed up and kept showing up. Sure, he made the same early adopter sales as everybody else, but then people noticed he didn't leave like all the other salespeople that they'd seen before. He stayed. By continuing to organize demonstration dinners, he got to know people in the town. He might engage with someone in the middle of the curve 5 or 6 or 7 times over the course of the month, which is precisely what this sort of person wants before they make a decision. Zig did the math. He understood that whilst most salespeople would flee when they hit the chasm, he could build a human bridge across it. So again, I'm going to show you that diagram at the end of this book review, but it's basically one way to ensure that you don't end up in a situation where there's a lot of early excitement and attention and then things just die off and pretty much die off for good. Kind of, again, like the YouTuber girl that I mentioned earlier. He talks about creating tension. So he said, tension is felt when you're challenged to cross a threshold. And the only way to resolve that tension is by forward motion. It breaks the status quo. So if you imagine that you've joined a webinar and the webinar is talking about a particular problem that businesses face, and then the webinar challenges you and says, if this is something that you're facing right now, the only way to get past it is to do X. That's the challenge. That's the tension that's been created. And so you've got 2 choices at that moment. You can either cross the threshold and resolve that tension, or you can do nothing and maintain the status quo. And Seth basically says that all great marketers create tension. He talks about status a lot in the book. I'd already mentioned that's one of the things that he says is a big motivator in buying decisions. And he says people express their status in one of 2 ways. They either do it through affiliation or they do it through dominance. Funny story is company I used to work in, there was a very toxic manager who tried to do both. So what he would do is he would use affiliation. So he would basically try and cling on to the upper management, and whenever they were out at social events and there was alcohol involved, he would be out there as well, and he would come in stinking of it the next day, and he was doing his best to just be in the in group, if you understand what I mean by that. But then he would also use dominance. So some of the more experienced consultants, there were people in his team that had more experience than he did. He would be very toxic towards them, would tell them that they sucked in front of everybody. So that was another way that he was trying to express his status, was to dominate them. Obviously, in this day and age with social media and transparency, affiliation is obviously the recommended route, but those are the two ways that it can be done. And then the last thing that I took away from Seth's book was he mentions funnels, and he says he actually listed a few more, but I've narrowed it down. There are 3 keys to good funnels. So firstly, they need to get the right people. Dan Locke even said this as well about, getting the attention of the right people at the right time. You need to remove as many steps and decisions as possible, because obviously every time you create a decision point, it's a new tension, a new threshold they have to cross. So the less of those, the quicker you can get them from the very beginning to the very end of the funnel. And then finally, use tension to create that forward motion. So I thought those were very good points. Now look, this is the Gartner hype cycle that was mentioned earlier. If you go to Wikipedia and look this thing up, it's primarily aimed at technology. That's why you even see in the bottom left of the window, technology trigger. But the way that Seth describes it in his book is as a meta-analysis of how culture changes. I thought that was quite a great way of putting it. But basically, let's think about artificial intelligence, for example. AI has been through a number of these in the last few decades, where there's the big boom of inflated expectations. Then things don't really pan out the way people hoped, and people kind of lose interest. They call that the AI winter. I saw this with Theranos as well, the technology company for testing for blood to look at different kinds of diseases that a person may have, or conditions. And the whole thing, unfortunately, was a lot of hype and not a lot of substance. But that kind of went through the same thing. There was this inflated expectation, lots of investment, and then it kind of all fell apart. And so the story that I read earlier on about Zig Ziglar, what Seth is basically saying is you can, to some degree, mitigate that trail of disillusionment by building that human bridge. And so by putting the effort in, by showing up every day and building that trust. So I thought that was a pretty interesting analogy, and I think that it does make a lot of sense in the real world. So I hope that was helpful. Those were my takeaways from Seth's book. I thought it was pretty good. If you have any questions, or you want to see any other book reviews, please send them over to support@CCXP Exam Simulator. I'm also on LinkedIn as well. And I'll try to have another book review uploaded shortly. Thank you then. Bye-bye.